Good morning everyone, and welcome back to the Isle of Wight. More specifically, it's just the Isle of Wight route in TSW2. And as you can tell, we're at Ryde Pier Head with a Class 483. And this will just be a very short, well, relatively short and easy run down to Shanklin, I hope. That's strange that when you spawn in the seat is up, because that makes sense. Right, just got to set this thing up, of course, and it's very similar to what you would later get with the 1972 stock. But of course, rather famously, the Class 483s are just old 1938 stock that were, of course, refurbished in the late 1980s, and I think they started running on the Isle of Wight in the early 90s, which is quite surprising considering just how old these units already were. And of course, when they first came to the Isle of Wight, they replaced the Class 485 or 486 EMUs, which were former standard stock from the 1920s. Right, so okay, we've got an on-time departure, and looks like the signals are cleared as far as Ryde Esplanade. And I think that's one of those cases where the signal will clear only once you've completed the objective. This is some good lighting for getting a shot of the train leaving the pier. Might not be the right angle on the train, but oh well. Of course, that's one of the many bizarre aspects of this island line, is the fact that the northern terminus is out at the end of a pier. Reminds me of a Dad's Army episode where Captain Mannering and I think about 5 of the other men had to were stationed out on the edge of out on the end of the pier in Wilmington-on-Sea to man a machine gun post. And one thing I've just remembered about Ryde Pier Head is that station actually used to have like 4 tracks, so it was a lot bigger than it is now. And there in the middle, between the rail deck and like the road deck and what have you, that's like the remnants of an old tramway. And from what I gather, one of the old cars from the pier tramway is preserved, I think, at the Isle of Wight Steam Railway, which we'll see a little bit of the IOWSR later, because of course this service, the route goes past Smallbrook Junction, and unfortunately no steamers in TSW yet. Might also be worth mentioning that even though we're on a double track section here, well, physically a double track section, it's actually operated as if it were just a single track, because excuse me, yeah, this other track here at the Esplanade and up along the pier, that's out of action, and in real life it had been for many years. And I think even when the island line was upgraded last year, I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty sure they didn't reinstate the second track along the pier. And then of course there's this classic vantage point where you look down on the bridge and then see the Class 483, and then see the trains go into the tunnel, or go through the crossover and into the tunnel, which is quite curious because this is the only part of the island line that is technically underground. And yeah, it really is a huge contrast to the original operating environments of the Class 483s. And speaking of which, more recently, Rivet Games did make the original 1938 stock as an add-on for TSW, and that you can drive that on the Bakerloo line. So you can then compare the different operating environments, and mind you, there's sort of almost no comparison really, but still fun to look at the two different lines regardless. Yes, originally I think some of these specific units that ended up on the Isle of Wight were actually built around 1940, and yeah, I think by the time of their retirement, they were the oldest mainline rolling stock in the UK. Because that's the other strange thing about the Island Line, is that it's not a heritage line. It is operated as part of the National Rail network, even though of course it is completely isolated from the rest of the system. And of course originally the Isle of Wight had a much more extensive network of railway lines than what it has today, when it used to have lines going to places like, well, originally there was the town of Newport, which is roughly in the middle of the island. That was like the central almost like, I don't know if headquarters is the right word, but it was like the hub of the network. And you had lines going up to Cowes and across to Ryde, then down towards like Sandown through I think Murstone. And then the other thing is this current route from Ryde to Shanklin, prior to 1967, that actually continued a further 4 miles down to Ventnor, with one last intermediate stop at Wroxall, which sounds like rock salt. But what else? But yeah, it was 1966, like specifically December 31st, 1966, when steam operations on the island finally ended, and the last type of steam locomotive to work regular services on this network were the ex-London and South Western Railway O2 tanks, not to be confused with the modern day O2 Arena in London, of course. And why any part of this network was, or why any lines on the Isle of Wight were retained after the abolition of steam, is beyond me. Like, I don't know why this section between Ryde and Shanklin was retained, and let alone electrified. But I still think it's good that it's a very good thing that the British Rail did retain this 8.5 miles of track, even though of course it's a tiny portion of what used to be. And I just realised another branch of the old network two other branches of the old network I've forgotten to mention were, I think it was one from Murstone to Ventnor West, and then another one from Brading to Bembridge. And of course we'll be stopping at Brading later on in this run, so I'll show you what used to be the platform for the Bembridge trains. That branch line closed in 1953, as far as I know. I think even by 1966 there wasn't that much of the network still left. I think, as far as I know, it would have just been like Ryde to Ventnor plus like Newport and Cowes, and I think that was it. But don't quote me on that, of course. Another thing I know about the railways on the Isle of Wight is that historically they never had, like even today, the Isle of Wight has never had any. Well, I don't know for certain, but for the longest time they've never had any like brand new rolling stock that was purpose built for this island, and instead it was all just second-hand stuff from the mainland. And of course that's the case with the Class 483s. There's another one going back towards Ryde. That one was in the Network Southeast livery, of course. And I should add that this one that we're driving is a custom London Transport Red reskin that I've made. It's not currently available, but I think once the Creators Club thing comes out I might try uploading it. But yeah, for now you can't. The only option to get, I think, a LT Red Class 483 in the game is to make the livery yourself. Anyway, yeah, so when the Ryde to Shanklin section was electrified in 1967, as for But the strange, as if the electrification wasn't strange enough, I think the motive power was actually the weirdest aspect of it. Because the floor of Ryde Tunnel, I believe it was raised about, I think 5 inches or something like that. Either way, the tunnel floor was raised quite substantially to try and cope with an issue of flooding. And that's why all the electric trains that have run on the Isle of Wight have been old underground stock. And I should also add that this station here at Smallbrook Junction, historically, like back in the steam era, there was never a station at this site, even though of course it was still called Smallbrook Junction back then, because this was where the line towards Newport branched off. And even in 1971, I think that was when the Isle of Wight Steam Railway started up. But back then they were only running between Haven Street and Wootton, and it wasn't until 1991 when they finally extended the... What's going on with this thing? It wasn't until 1991 when they finally extended the line to here to Smallbrook Junction, and this station was built solely to serve this Smallbrook Junction station was built in 1991 for the sole purpose of providing an interchange between the Island Line and the Isle of Wight Steam Railway, and it still serves that one sole purpose today. And another station on the line that wasn't on this current line that wasn't around in the steam era, we'll be seeing that later on as well, and that station is Lake. I don't know for certain whether or not this section south of Smallbrook Junction was single track or double track in the steam era, but I know that up until the 1980s, the section between Brading and Sandown absolutely was double track. And yeah, for whatever reason, I think that double track or crossing loop or whatever it was removed in the 1980s, and since then, and up until very early in 2021, it left the line with a very unusual timetable, or erratic, as I think Andy from Calling All Stations once put it. Because the train, rather than like an even half-hourly service, the line ran with the trains separated at 20 and 40-minute intervals. So I mean, it was still 2 trains an hour, but yeah, a bit of inconsistent frequency. So yeah, back to the thing with the early electrification in the 60s, and initially the rolling stock that British Rail brought in was the old standard, the former standard stock. From I think those were built between like 1923 and 1931, but don't quote me on that. Apologies for that long pause. I was just having a drink of water. So yeah, the standard stock was notable because even though they were obviously EMUs, and I think by the standards of the day, no pun intended, they probably would have been seen as state of the art. But the problem with the standard stock was the fact that all the electrical equipment for like the driving cars was in a big switch compartment at like one or both ends of the unit, and that took up the switch compartment was right above a bogie and behind the driver's cab, and it took up about 1/3 of the length of the coach. And the 38 stock, which obviously you see here, when these were quite revolutionary for the tube, the design of tube trains, because these were the first production tube trains to have all the electrical equipment underneath the floor. So that left the entire interior of the coach, aside from the driver's cab, available for passenger use. Although before the 38 stock, you had the 35 stock, which were essentially prototypes for the 38s. And weirdly, a couple of the 35 units had streamlined cabs, which to me looks very unusual, especially for a humble London Underground train. And the streamlined cabs, of course, didn't catch on, and these days, of course, none of the current London Underground trains have streamlined ends. So the 38 stock, excuse me again, they served on, I think, like the Northern, Bakerloo, Piccadilly, yeah, I think just those lines possibly until, because they didn't have the Victoria or Jubilee line back in those days, or in the early days of the 38 stock. I mean, the Victoria line didn't come along until 1968, and the Jubilee line didn't come along until 1979. But despite the incredible thing about the 38 stock was just how long they'd served on the Underground. Because I think, they would have been first introduced around 1938 or 1939. And, despite the fact that they were already about 50 years old, in the late 90s, British Rail still brought, I think it was, they refurbished the units and reformed them into 9 two-car units, plus I think it would have been a 19th coach acting only as a spare. And they were brought to the Isle of Wight, I think, starting in 1989. But I think they entered service in they started entering service in 1990. And then the standard stock was replaced. Before I go any further with the history of the trains themselves, I'd like to mention, of course, now that we're at Brading, I think this area where like the grass and dirt is, I think this would have originally been like the bay platform for the branch line that ran to Bembridge, because that would have, I think, you can't tell all that well, but I think it would have left the station going north, but then curved off to the east. And there was one intermediate stop on the branch at St Helens, but I'm pretty sure that closed, as I said earlier, I'm pretty sure that line closed in 1953. And you'll notice, of course, that there's 2 platforms still intact here, this rendition of Brading Station, because when Rivet Games did their this add-on for TSW was made by Rivet Games, and they, from what I understand, they did their survey of the routes either in early 2020. Yeah, it would have been early 2020, I think, because this add-on came out only about a month or so after after TSW2 itself. And when they did the survey, this was obviously before the line had closed for several months for upgrade works, and back then they still had this awkward situation where there was no longer it was just single track between here and Sandown, and as a result, I already mentioned the erratic timetable, so I won't repeat myself in that regard. But sorry for the awkward silence. So, in real life, I think I watched one of Simon Train's videos where he went to the Isle of Wight and filmed the Class 484s, which are actually rebuilt ex-District Line D78 stock. And in those videos, and like with how the Island Line is now, I believe the height of the platforms have been raised across all the stations along the line, and the crossing loop here at Brading has actually been reinstated, so that now they can run half-hourly services on the line once again. So the 483s, so the original 38 stock, they originally, so what am I saying? I remember that I think some of the oldest units that were still running on the Northern Line, I think in the 70s, or it might have been the 80s, I think, because I know the 1972 stock, they were used on the Jubilee line in the early years of that route. And I think at one point some of them ended up going to the Northern line to allow like some of the worst or oldest of the 38 stock to be scrapped. But yeah, I don't know the specifics of that incident. Another thing I know is, well, of course, that awful, truly awful crash at Moorgate in 1975, that involved a set of 1938 stock. And but despite that, the train soldiered on, and of course the underground is now a lot safer. Although I suppose regular commuters would probably have you believe otherwise. But I think in terms of making sure the trains don't crash, the tube is definitely a lot safer now, and I say that despite never having been to London. I will go to London and the rest of England, well, and the UK eventually, but anyway, yeah, I'll get back to blabbering about the Isle of Wight, I suppose. So, as I said earlier, when the Class 483s initially entered service on the line in Network South East days, there were 9 two-car units that were initially brought in, with one spare coach that of course was never used in passenger service. It was unofficially dubbed 483010, but really the actual 483 numbers only went as far as 483009. And so, weirdly, some of the quite a few of the 483s, which were like numbers 1, 3 and 5, I think they were all scrapped in like the early 2000s, somewhere around then. And they might have also been around the time when the surviving units were repainted in that strange blue livery with all that dinosaur artwork. So I don't know how long they retained the Network South East colours for. I don't think it was as long as the 1992 stock on the Waterloo and City line, or as they were originally called, Class 482s. So the 483s that survived, I think they were units numbers 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 and 9. So if 7 and 9 weren't there, you could do a Tom Robinson reference. And yeah, kudos to those who, like me, know the song 2468 Motorway. Yeah, that's the pantheon of good songs that are far too short. Anyway, so yes, here we are coming into Sandown, which historically was known for, at least in the 21st century, being a main crossing point for the line. And this used to be a junction for the line that went to Newport via Mirstone. But in all honesty, I don't know when that particular part of the network was closed. And so, sorry, I'm just kind of losing track of it. Oh, in real life, I should add, this siding is where, I think even now there's still an old 483 unit that's stabled here, or at least one was stabled here in like the first few months of Class 484 operation. Because yeah, this was the road, I believe, that that the big heavy trucks came up on their journey. I think it was Yarmouth, where they brought in the Class 484 vehicles, and they were brought here to Sandown and then placed on the track and somehow taken to Ryde. Presumably, for all I know, they might have done that delivery trip from Sandown to Ryde under their own power. I remember that I think when the first Class 483 arrived on the Isle of Wight, it was actually hauled from Sandown to Ryde by one of the older Class 485 or standard stock units. And yeah, in terms of the standard stock time on the Isle of Wight, I'm not really familiar with that era. Aside from the fact that originally the Class 485s were the 3-car units, and then the 485s were the 4-car units, and 486s were the 3-car units. but later on they got reformed so that the 485s were 5-car units and the 486s were just 2-car units. With the 483s, of course, they were a lot more standardised, and they were all just 2-car units, although of course they could couple up and run in 4-car formations during like summer months or just general periods when the line was very busy. Of course, in their final months of operation, I think there was only one Class 483 that was still in running order, which meant that they could only do an hourly service along the island line. And curiously, one of the surviving 483s, which was 483-007, that was still given a full overhaul and put back into service, I think, in December 2020, despite the fact that it was less than 2 months away from retirement. But fortunately, 483-007 is preserved, and she's on display in the Train Story exhibition hall at the Isle of Wight Steam Railway. But as far as I know, there are at least 2 other 483 units still around. One that's also preserved on the Isle of Wight, but I forget where that one's gone. And then the other one I said earlier that, as far as I know, is still in that siding at Sandown. Anyway, here's a very slow arrival into Lake, which, as I said earlier, was another station that wasn't, or which, like Smallbrook Junction, the station wasn't built until long after the steamers had gone. And I think in this case it wasn't built until like 1987 or 1991. Although I'm not sure why it's called Lake, because you can see that we're right there by the sea. And that's not a lake. I think that'd be the English Channel or the Solent, wouldn't it? Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Speaking of the Solent, I know that was where the RMS Olympic, one time that massive ocean liner had a nasty collision with, was it the HMS Hawk? Because I think I'm getting that confused with. I'm a bit muddled because no, it was the collision with the Nantucket light. I think it was LV 117 Nantucket lightship. That was near the US, but I forget exactly where. What was it? The Nantucket Shoals. I don't know. So anyway, I think by the time, like the last year of operation for these Class 483s, I think the reason why they ended up in the situation where they only had one working unit is, from what I understand, it was due to the age of the units, because by this point they were about like 80 or like 79 or 80 years old, which is absolutely ancient for any train, let alone one that was still in revenue earning service. And so, yeah, I think it was getting to the point where it was just too expensive to try to source existing parts, even though I think quite a few years ago unit number 483002 was taken out of service and used as like a spare parts donor or something of that nature. And I don't know what happened to 483002, but I would assume that one's actually been scrapped, which is sad, of course, but well, considering how iconic these trains are. But the good thing is there are at least 3 483 units still around today, and there's a few original 1938 stock cars preserved back on the mainland. Like there's one at the London Transport Museum in Covent Garden, and out at the Acton Depot, the same museum has also got an operational 4-car set, which in modern times has done occasional excursions on the current underground network, like going along I think mainly the district and metropolitan lines. You'd never get the 38 stock on the Victoria line, that's for sure. So yeah, now we're coming into Shanklin, which is very slowly into Shanklin. This has been the terminus of the line since 1967. But as I said earlier, the line used to continue down to Ventnor. And yeah, this is like braiding. That this one is depicted in its condition where there's the space for the second track, but it's not there. Or as the zombies would have said, she's not there. Although, yeah, it looks there's no. Oh, there is the other platform. These days, I think there's a bus service that runs between Shanklin and Ventnor, which I think would for the people, for the powers that be, would be a lot easier to run than a railway. And frankly, I think it's incredible that, despite the uncertain future this line is facing in the final years of Class 483 service, I'm amazed that it was still that like Network Rail and whoever else was I think it would have been Network Rail saw it fit, saw to it that the line should be upgraded and to continue going for many more years. And even though the trains that run on this line now are ex-District Line D78 stock units, I think it's safe to say that the amount of work that Viva Rail did to rebuild them, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the 484s were brand new trains. Although I suppose, for all I know, they could have done a poster in the train like what Viva Rail did with the Class 230s, which are the original D78 stock rebuilds. Or at least for the units that run on the Marston Vale line, they've got like information boards above the windows that tell the passengers that these trains are rebuilt or are like a former District Line stock. And trying to get this door closed button, but it doesn't seem to want to work. It's a little odd. Anyway, I suppose I'll go back to the cab and close the doors there. Yeah, I just think that the Isle of Wight is also one of the few places where I actually know a sizable amount about its history, but like not in the days like the Isle of Wight Central or Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport railways. I mainly know like the history from like the BR era onwards. Anyway, so yeah, all I can really say to finish off talking about the Isle of Wight's railways is I wish the current operation good luck for the future, and of course that goes for the Class 484s as well. And someday, even though I've obviously missed my chance to ride the 483s, I will still go to the Isle of Wight someday to obviously ride the 484s, and because even though the 483s are gone, this line is still very unique in that it's still isolated from the mainland, still has the northern terminus on the end of a pier, and still uses old London Underground stock. And yeah, it's just a really cool line. And I think, credit where it's due, I think this is the best, by far the best Rivet Games products that company has made, because for the most part I don't like their stuff at all. But yeah, I mean, this route is, I don't know why I keep going in and out of the cab, but I should add. But anyway, yeah, the Isle of Wight is a route that I can highly recommend if you want to, if you still want to play TSW, but aren't really like comfortable with aren't really comfortable with doing anything like doing really intense jobs like the München S-Bahn or I don't know, freight train on Sandpatch grade. But no, yeah, feel free to let me know in the comments if you've got any thoughts on the Isle of Wight route and Rivet Games as a whole, and if it turns out that you do like Rivet Games and their products, I respect your opinion, of course, but I still disagree. Especially since I can't get the Arosa line to work, or I can't get that to load because it will just crash every time I try loading a scenario. But regardless, I think that's quite enough of me rambling. So I think I'll go and end the video here. So yeah, I think until next time, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching, and feel free to check out some of my other TSW videos. And yeah, I guess all I can really say now is yeah, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.